The paper was old. It was brittle as dried leaves in late autumn, stained with the brown rings of coffee cups and the darker, rust-colored smudges of dried blood. Across its surface, lines of black ink intersected with mathematical precision, forming arches, trusses, and load-bearing pillars. It was a drawing of a bridge, a thick red line, drawn with violent force, slashed through the center of the design. It looked like a wound. "My father did not save my mother because of kindness," the voice of an old woman whispers, her tone rasping like wind over sandstone. "He did not save her because she was beautiful, or because he was a hero. Heroes are things you read about in dime novels. And my father, Elias Thorne, did not believe in fiction." The camera pans over the blueprint, lingering on the signature in the corner, sterling. Then, it moves to the edge of the paper, where a different hand has scrawled calculations in the margins, calculations that prove the structure was doomed to fail. "He saved her." The voice continues, "because of the copper tube strapped to her back. He saw the glint of metal in the snow and thought it was a rifle. He thought she was a soldier coming to kill him. And in a way, she was. She was carrying the ghost that had been hunting him for 3 years. For a long time, in that cabin buried by silence and snow, they pointed their wounds at each other like loaded guns." High Plains, Colorado Territory. Late November 1870. The wind in the High Plains did not blow, it screamed. It tore through the canyons of the Rockies, stripping the bark from the pines and polishing the gray stones until they shone like iron. To Elias Thorne, the wind sounded exactly like the twisting of metal. It sounded like the groan of a rivet shearing under pressure, the prelude to a collapse. Elias stood on the roof of his cabin, a hammer in his hand. He was 32 years old, but his eyes were ancient, the color of wet slate, sunk deep into a face hardened by high-altitude sun and solitude. He did not look like a rancher. His hands, though calloused, were not thick and clumsy. They were long-fingered, precise. Even now, wrapped in fingerless wool gloves, they gripped the hammer with a specific, calculated tension. He was fixing a loose shingle. Not because it was leaking, but because when the wind hit it at a certain angle, it vibrated. It made a sound. Elias could not tolerate unnecessary sound. He drove the nail in. Tap. Tap. Thud. He paused, listening. The vibration was gone. The roof was silent. He climbed down the ladder, moving with the efficient, jerky grace of a man who expects to be shot at. His cabin was not a home, it was a fortress. The logs were hewn thick, the gaps chinked with a mixture of mud and straw that dried as hard as concrete. The windows were narrow slits, covered with heavy shutters that could be barred from the inside. He had built it not to keep the warmth in, but to keep the world out. He walked the perimeter. He did this 3 times a day. Morning, noon, dusk. It was a ritual of survival, a tick of a mind that had forgotten how to rest. He checked the tripwires he had strung through the brush, thin lines connected to hanging tin cans. Primitive, but effective, the snow was beginning to fall. It started as lazy, fat flakes, but the sky to the west was bruising purple, heavy and low. A blizzard was coming. A bad one. The air tasted of ozone and ice. Elias reached the north corner of his fence line when he saw it. At first, his mind registered it as a dead deer. A dark, crumpled shape half buried in a drift against the split-rail fence. But deer didn't wear wool. Deer didn't have the unnatural, angular geometry of a human collapse. Elias didn't run. He didn't gasp. He stopped moving entirely. He became a statue in the snow, his breath pluming in short, controlled bursts. His hand moved instinctively to the Colt Navy revolver at his hip, unsnapping the leather strap. He scanned the tree line. Was this bait? A decoy? In the war, they would leave a body on the road and wait in the trees for the Samaritan to stop. Elias had been an engineer in the Corps, but he had seen enough ambushes to know that mercy was often the first mistake of the dead. Nothing moved in the trees. The tin cans on his perimeter wire were silent. He advanced slowly, his boots crunching on the frozen crust. He kept his gun drawn, the barrel lowered but ready. As he got closer, the shape resolved. It was a woman. She was lying face down, her legs twisted at an awkward angle. She wore a heavy traveling coat that had once been expensive, fine blue wool, now stained with mud and grease. Her hat was gone. Her hair, dark and matted with ice, fanned out across the white snow like spilled ink. But it wasn't her hair that caught Elias's eye. It was the object strapped across her back. It was a long, cylindrical tube made of copper. It was dented and tarnished, strapped tight to her body with leather belts that looked like they had been cut from a horse's harness. It glinted dully in the fading light. A weapon? Elias thought. A dismantled rifle barrel? A map case? He reached her. He didn't check her pulse. Not yet. He knelt in the snow, his knee pressing into the ice, and reached for the tube. He needed to know if she was armed. He grabbed the leather strap and pulled. The woman gasped. It was a terrible, ragged sound, like air being sucked through a cracked flute. Her body convulsed, a spasm of pure instinct, and her hand, gloved in torn leather, shot out and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was shockingly strong. Elias froze. He looked down. She had turned her head. Her face was gray, the lips blue and cracked, the skin around her eyes burned raw by the wind. But her eyes were open. They were dark, dilated, and filled with a feral, terrifying desperation. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the tube in his hand. Mine! She tried to say, but no sound came out. Her lips just formed the shape of possession. Elias holstered his gun. He looked at her hand gripping his wrist, then at the copper tube. He saw the way the leather strap had dug into her shoulder, wearing away the fabric of her coat. She hadn't just been carrying it, she had been clinging to it. Let go, Elias said. His voice was rusty from disuse. She shook her head, a microscopic movement against the snow. You're freezing, he said, stating a fact, not an emotion. If you don't let go, I can't lift you. If I don't lift you, you die here. The logic seemed to penetrate the fog of hypothermia. Her fingers loosened, but didn't detach. She simply lost the strength to hold on. Her hand fell back into the snow limp. Her eyes rolled back, and she went limp. Elias stood up. He looked at the storm gathering on the horizon. The wind was picking up, whistling through the gaps in his fence. He felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the phantom sound of wood splintering. He didn't want this. He didn't want a guest. He didn't want a corpse. He wanted silence, but he couldn't leave her. Not because he was kind, but because he needed to know what was in the tube. People didn't walk into the Colorado winter to die for nothing. He bent down, scooped her up. She was terrifyingly light, nothing but bone and heavy wool, and turned back toward the fortress. The copper tube knocked rhythmically against his spine with every step, a metallic heartbeat against the rising wind. The inside of the cabin was dark, smelling of pine resin, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of gun oil. Elias kicked the door shut behind him and threw the heavy oak bar into place. The sound of the lock engaging was a solid thunk that usually brought him peace. Today, it felt like locking himself in a cage with a wild animal. He carried her to the space in front of the hearth. There was no rug. Rugs held dust and muffled footsteps. He laid her directly on the wooden floorboards. He lit a kerosene lamp. The yellow light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. He knelt beside her and began his assessment. It wasn't a medical exam, it was a structural inspection. He stripped off her outer coat. It was frozen stiff. Underneath, she wore a dress that belonged in a Boston parlor, not a mountain blizzard. The silk was torn, the lace cuffs gray with grime. He saw the copper tube again. He reached for the buckle to unstrap it from her back. Even unconscious, she flinched. A tremor ran through her body as his fingers touched the metal. Easy, Elias muttered, though he wasn't speaking to her. He was speaking to the situation, trying to control the variables. He unbuckled the tube and set it aside, placing it on his workbench, far out of her reach. Then he turned back to the woman. He checked her limbs. No breaks, though her ankle was swollen to the size of a grapefruit, the skin purple and tight. He pulled off her boots, expensive leather, worn through at the soles. Her feet were white, the early stages of frostbite gnawing at the toes. He worked with clinical efficiency. He fetched a basin of snow, mixing it with water from the kettle until it was cool. Not warm. He knew that heat was the enemy of frozen flesh. It caused agony and tissue death. He began to rub her feet with snow, his rough hands moving with surprising gentleness. She groaned. It was a low, guttural sound. Elias ignored it. He moved to her hands. He cleaned the cuts on her palms. Defensive wounds? Scrapes from falling? He couldn't tell. Then he saw her neck. He pushed back the collar of her dress to check for a pulse. There, just below the jawline, was a bruise. It wasn't a fresh bruise. It was old, yellow-green, fading. It was the shape of a hand. Someone had choked her. Not today. Maybe a week ago. Maybe 2. Elias sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on a rag. Who are you? He thought. And who is chasing you? He looked at the copper tube on the bench. It sat there in the gloom, heavy with secrets. He stood up and walked over to it. The metal was cold under his fingers. There was no lock, but the cap was screwed on tight, sealed with wax to make it watertight. He picked up a chisel. He could pry the wax off. He could open it right now. Crack. A sound from the floor. Elias spun around, his hand dropping to the knife on his belt. The woman was awake. She hadn't moved much, she couldn't, but her eyes were open. They were fixing him with a gaze of absolute clarity. There was no gratitude in that look. There was only calculation. She was looking at him, then at the knife, then at the tube in his hand. I didn't open it, Elias said. She stared. She didn't speak. She didn't try to speak. She just watched him. Her chest rising and falling in shallow, painful hitches. You have frostbite, Elias said. You're malnourished. You have a sprained ankle. And a storm is hitting us that will likely bury this cabin for 3 days. Silence. Can you speak? She blinked once. Slowly. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a no. It was an acknowledgement that she had heard him. Elias frowned. Are you mute? She looked away from him, her gaze traveling up to the ceiling beams, tracing the way the logs interlocked. She was studying the construction of his house. She looked at the heavy shutters. She looked at the triple-barred door. When she looked back at him, her expression had changed. The fear was dampened. In its place was a strange recognition. She saw the fortress. She understood the paranoia. She pulled her hand out from under the blanket Elias had thrown over her. She pointed a trembling finger at the tube. Then she brought her finger to her lips. Silence. Elias stared at her. You want me to keep it secret? She shook her head. She pointed to the tube, then to her chest, then to the door. It stays with me, or I leave. Elias let out a short, harsh laugh. You can't walk to the privy, let alone leave. You're in no position to negotiate, lady. He slammed the tube down on the workbench. The sound was loud, clang. The woman flinched violently, clapping her hands over her ears, curling into a ball. She squeezed her eyes shut, her mouth opening in a silent scream of pain. It wasn't the pain of the ankle. It was the noise. Elias froze. He knew that reaction. He saw it in the mirror every time thunder rolled through the valley. He saw it every time a tree branch snapped too loudly. Hyperacusis. Sensitivity to sound. Trauma. He watched her trembling on the floor, trying to block out the echo of the metal on wood. Elias slowly lowered his hands. He felt a strange, unwanted pang of empathy. He wasn't looking at a stranger anymore. He was looking at a mirror image of his own broken nervous system. All right, he whispered. The word was barely a breath. All right. Quiet. He picked up the tube, gently this time, and walked over to her. He placed it on the floor next to her hand. She stopped trembling. She opened her eyes. She reached out and curled her fingers around the cold copper. She pulled it against her chest, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. Elias retreated to his chair by the fire. He picked up his whittling knife and a piece of pine. He didn't look at her. "Sleep," he said softly. "The storm is here." Outside, the wind slammed against the north wall, screaming like a dying train. Inside, there was only the sound of the fire popping, and two people breathing in the dark, guarding their secrets. The blizzard lasted 4 days. For 4 days, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the white wall against the windows and the howling darkness. The cabin became a capsule, suspended in time. For Elias, who had spent 3 years cultivating isolation, the presence of another human being should have been maddening. He expected her to talk. He expected her to ask questions, to cry, to demand comfort. But she did none of those things. She was a ghost. She lay on the pallet of blankets he had made for her near the hearth, drifting in and out of fever dreams. When she was awake, she was silent. She watched him. She watched him perform his perimeter checks, pacing the interior of the cabin when the snow blocked the door. She watched him clean his gun, stripping it down to the springs and pins, oiling it, and reassembling it blindfolded. She learned his rhythm. She learned that he flinched when the wind gusted particularly hard against the roof. She learned that he didn't eat much, just dried venison and black coffee, and Elias watched her. He learned that her name was Julianne. He found it embroidered on a handkerchief in her pocket, J.S. He decided to call her Jules in his head. It sounded tougher. He learned that she had a mind for structure. On the second day, the fever broke. She was sitting up, sipping broth he had made. The wind was hammering the roof, and a loose board in the loft was rattling. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Elias was pacing, his jaw clenched. The sound was driving a spike into his temple. He couldn't reach the board without going outside, which was suicide in this wind. Julianne set her cup down. She didn't speak. She picked up a piece of charcoal from the hearth. She dragged herself, painfully, dragging her bad leg, over to where the floorboards met the wall. She tapped on a specific wedge of wood that Elias had used to shim the wall logs. Elias looked at her. "What?" She pointed to the wedge, then pointed to the ceiling where the rattling was coming from. She made a motion of driving in. Elias frowned. "The shim? That's for the wall settling." She shook her head. She drew a quick sketch on the floorboards. It was a diagram of force distribution. She showed that if he drove the shim deeper at the base, it would torque the vertical log just enough to tighten the joint at the roofline. Elias stared at the charcoal drawing. It was crude, but the physics were sound. It was engineering. He looked at her. She was watching him with those intelligent, expectant eyes. He picked up his mallet. He went to the wall and struck the shim. Bam! Bam! The vertical log groaned, shifting a fraction of an inch. Above them, the rattling stopped. The loose board was pinched tight by the shift in pressure. Silence returned. Elias dropped the mallet. He looked at Julianne. For the first time, he didn't see a refugee. He saw a colleague. "Who are you?" he asked. She didn't answer. She just wiped the charcoal dust from her fingers and picked up her broth. But there was a flicker of a smile, tiny, almost imperceptible, at the corner of her mouth. It was the first crack in the ice. By the 5th day, the storm broke. The sun came out, blinding and cold, reflecting off 4 feet of fresh snow. The silence of the storm was replaced by the silence of the aftermath. But the tension in the cabin had shifted. It was no longer the tension of strangers. It was the tension of two people who knew too much about each other without knowing anything at all. Julianne could hobble now. Using a crude crutch Elias had fashioned from a broom handle, she began to take over small tasks. She organized his pantry, arranging the tins by size and content. She swept the floor, but she never let the copper tube out of her sight. When she went to the basin to wash, she took it with her. When she slept, it was under her arm. Elias's paranoia, which had been dormant during the storm, began to wake up. Why was she guarding it? Was it money? Stolen bonds? Or was it something worse? He remembered the war. He remembered the spies who carried maps of troop movements in hollowed-out walking sticks. He remembered the bridge. The bridge. The memory hit him while he was chopping wood outside. The sound of the axe hitting the frozen pine, crack, sounded like the snapped cable. 1867. The Purgatory River Bridge. He had designed the abutments. He had warned them that the shale was unstable. He had warned the chief engineer, Arthur Sterling, that the load-bearing calculations were based on high-grade steel, not the cheap iron the contractors were supplying. Sterling had laughed. "You worry too much, Thorne. It's a bridge, not a cathedral. Build it." So Elias built it. And 3 weeks after it opened, a train carrying a company of soldiers, his friends, his unit, crossed it. The sound. That was what he remembered. The scream of iron twisting. The silence after the splash. 22 men dead. And the inquiry? Arthur Sterling standing up in the courtroom, holding Elias's initial sketches that had been altered, and saying, "Lieutenant Thorne was negligent. He miscalculated the sheer strength. Dishonorable discharge. Exile. A life spent hiding in the mountains, waiting for the ghosts to find him." Elias drove the axe into the stump with a savage grunt. He looked back at the house. Julianne was sitting by the window, polishing the copper tube with the hem of her dress. A thought took root in his mind. A poisonous, logical thought. She was educated. She understood engineering. She was hiding something in a map case. Was she working for the railroad? Was she one of Sterling's people, come to finish the job? Come to find the mad engineer, and ensure he never spoke the truth? Elias pulled the axe from the wood. He walked back to the house. His face was a mask of cold fury. He kicked the snow off his boots and entered. Julianne looked up, sensing the shift in his mood immediately. She stiffened, her hand going to the tube. "We need to talk," Elias said. She stared at him, mute. "No more games?" he said, stepping closer. The cabin felt suddenly small. "You know physics. You know structures. You aren't a schoolteacher and you aren't a housewife. You're holding that tube like it's the keys to the kingdom." He pointed the handle of the axe at her. "Railroad?" She shook her head, her eyes widening. "Land surveyor? No. Pinkerton? No." She was backing away now, pressing herself against the rough logs of the wall. "Then give it to me," Elias said. He held out his hand. "If it's nothing, show me." Julianne clutched the tube to her chest. She shook her head violently. Her breath was coming in short gasps. "I saved your life," Elias said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "I brought you into my house. I fed you. I have a right to know if you're here to kill me." He lunged. It wasn't a graceful move. It was desperate. He grabbed the end of the copper tube. Julianne didn't scream. She fought. She kicked out with her good leg, catching him in the shin. She bit his hand hard, drawing blood. "Let go!" Elias roared, the pain triggering his adrenaline. They struggled in the center of the cabin, knocking over the chair, sending the basin of water crashing to the floor. It was a silent, vicious brawl. Julianne fought with the ferocity of a trapped wolf. She wasn't fighting for property, she was fighting for her life. Elias was stronger. He wrenched the tube from her grip. She fell back against the hearth, gasping, her eyes wild. She looked at him with pure hatred. "No!" she rasped. Her voice came back, torn from her throat by sheer panic. "Don't!" Elias ignored her. He retreated to the workbench, keeping the table between them. He held the tube up to the light. He saw the seal. He grabbed his chisel and jammed it under the cap. He twisted. The wax cracked. The cap unscrewed with a screech of metal on metal. Julianne was trying to stand up, clawing at the table leg. "It's mine!" Elias tipped the tube. A roll of paper slid out. It was heavy parchment, wrapped in oilskin. Elias's hands were shaking. He unfurled it on the workbench, weighing down the corners with tools. He looked down. The world stopped. The wind stopped. The fire stopped crackling. It was a blueprint. It wasn't just any blueprint. It was his blueprint. Purgatory River crossing South Fork elevation. But it wasn't the version that had been shown in court. It wasn't the altered version with the flawed calculations. It was the original. There, in the bottom right corner, was his own signature, clear and steady. And right next to it, written in red ink, was a note in handwriting he recognized instantly. Materials substandard. Iron grade C. Rejected. And below that rejection, an override stamp. Approved A. Sterling. Elias stared at the paper. His breath caught in his throat. This was it. The proof. The evidence that he hadn't killed his men. The evidence that Arthur Sterling had signed the death warrant for 22 soldiers to save money on iron. He traced the red ink with a trembling finger. Where? Elias whispered. Where did you get this? He looked up at Julianne. She had pulled herself up. She was leaning against the table, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't looking at the map. She was looking at him. He kept it, she whispered, her voice like broken glass. In his safe. Behind the portrait of his wife. Who? Elias asked. Sterling, my uncle, she said, the words hung in the air. Uncle. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. You're a Sterling? I'm Julianne Sterling, she said. She took a shuddering breath. Arthur is my uncle. But the man you worked with, the man who died 2 years after the trial. Supposedly from a heart attack. She looked at Elias, and he saw the resemblance now. The same sharp jawline. The same intelligent eyes. Robert Sterling was my father, she said. He didn't hate you, Elias. He tried to protect you. Arthur destroyed him for it. Elias looked back at the blueprint. Robert. The only man in the company who had treated him with respect. He had died. I found it, Julianne said, stepping closer, her limp pronounced. After my father died, Arthur took over everything. He took the house, the accounts. He locked me in the attic like a madwoman because I asked too many questions about the bridge. I found the safe key. I stole it. She reached out and touched the edge of the paper. I was coming to find you, she said. I didn't know if you were alive. I just knew. I knew you were the only one who could read it. The only one who could understand what it meant. Elias looked at her. He saw the bruises on her neck again. He knows, Elias said. Arthur knows you have it. He sent men after me, Julianne said. That's why I ran into the storm. That's why I couldn't speak. I thought if I stayed quiet, they couldn't find me. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. I didn't come to kill you, Elias. I came to give you your life back. Elias looked at the blueprint, then at the woman standing in his fortress. The silence of 3 years was shattering. The walls he had built to keep the world out had just been breached, not by an enemy, but by the truth. He looked at the tube. He looked at the gun on the table. He'll come for it, Elias said. If he knows you have this, he won't stop. I know, Julianne whispered. That's why I need you. I don't need a hero, Elias. I need an engineer. I need someone who knows how to build a trap. Elias looked at the blueprint one last time. He saw the red lines slashing through the bridge. The wound. He rolled up the paper. He slid it back into the copper tube. He screwed the cap on tight. He looked at Julianne. Check the window, he said. What? The south window. The shutter latch is loose. If a storm comes from the south, it'll rattle. Julianne stared at him, confused. If we're going to fight Arthur Sterling, Elias said, picking up his hammer, we need to fortify the perimeter. And I can't think when there's noise. He walked past her, brushing her shoulder. It was a gesture of acceptance. Get some sleep, Jules, he said. Tomorrow, we start building. December 1870 to February 1871, winter in the high plains did not leave all at once. It retreated in grudging inches. The white drifts that had buried the cabin to the eaves slowly hardened into gray ice, then dissolved into a slush that turned the world into mud. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer a prison. It was a workshop. Elias and Julianne moved around each other with the silent, practiced choreography of a seasoned crew. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. They spoke in the language of angles, fulcrums, and leverage. Julianne's ankle had healed enough for her to walk without the crutch, though she still favored her left leg, giving her gait a syncopated rhythm. Step, slide, step. She took over the kitchen, but not in the way a housewife would. She reorganized it. She moved the heavy cast iron skillets to a lower shelf so the torque on her wrist was minimized when lifting them. She rearranged the woodpile near the stove, stacking the logs in a crosshatch pattern that allowed for better airflow and faster drying. Elias watched her. He saw the way she looked at the world. Most people saw objects, Julianne saw forces. She saw gravity, friction, and tension constantly at war. One evening, deep in January, a heavy beam in the root cellar began to sag. It was an old timber, rotted by dampness, groaning under the weight of the floor above. Elias went down with his tools, ready to shore it up with brute strength and a fresh log. He found Julianne already there. She was holding a candle, staring at the rotting wood, her brow furrowed. "Don't touch it," Elias warned, coming down the ladder. "It's unstable. If it snaps, the pantry floor comes down. It won't snap in the center," Julianne said. Not looking at him, she pointed to the far wall. "The shear stress is highest at the joint. If you put a vertical post here, you're just transferring the load to a weak point in the foundation." Elias stopped. He looked at where she was pointing. He visualized the weight distribution in his head. She was right. If he had done it his way, he might have cracked the stone foundation. "What do you suggest?" he asked. It was a genuine question. Julianne crouched down, using a stick to draw in the dirt floor. "A cantilever," she said. "We brace it from the side wall, at a 45-degree angle. We use the wall's mass to hold the floor, bypassing the rotted beam entirely until we can replace it in spring." Elias looked at the drawing. It was elegant. It was risky. It was brilliant. "I have the timber for it," Elias said. "But I can hold the angle and drive the bolts at the same time." Julianne looked up at him. In the flickering candlelight, her face was smudged with dust, her eyes bright and fierce. "I can hold it. It's heavy, Jules. I know the weight," she said. "I calculated it. I can hold it." They worked for 3 hours. The cellar was cold, smelling of wet earth and old potatoes. It was grueling physical labor. Elias cut the timber, Julianne guided it into place. When it came time to set the brace, Elias had to trust her. He had to put his full weight on the bolt, trusting that she wouldn't let the timber slip and crush his hand. "Ready?" he asked, sweat stinging his eyes. "Ready," she grunted. Her arms were trembling, muscles taut as wire, but her grip was iron. Elias drove the bolt home. He cranked the wrench, the metal screeching in the confined space. 1 turn. 2 turns. The timber bit into the wood. The sagging floor above groaned, then settled. Silence. Elias dropped the wrench. He leaned back against the cold stone wall, breathing hard. Julianne slumped against the opposite wall, rubbing her aching arms. They looked at the brace. It held. Perfect geometry. Elias looked at Julianne. "You have good hands," he said. It was the highest compliment he knew how to give. Julianne looked at her hands, scarred, callous, dirt under the fingernails. They were no longer the hands of a Boston debutante. "My father wanted a son," she said quietly. "He wanted someone to take over the firm. When he realized he only had me, he tried to keep me out of the drafting room. But I used to steal his discarded plans and redraw them. Correct them." She looked at Elias. "He never admitted I was right. He would just leave the corrected plans on his desk and use them. He was a fool." Elias said. Julianne smiled, but it was a sad, fragile thing. "He was a man of his time, Elias. Just like you, I'm not a man of my time," Elias said, pushing himself off the wall. "My time ended 3 years ago. I'm just a ghost haunting a mountain. Ghosts don't build cantilevers," Julianne said. She reached out and picked up the wrench he had dropped. She held it out to him handle first. "Ghosts don't trust anyone to hold the timber." Elias took the wrench. His fingers brushed hers. The contact was brief, electric, and terrifying. The trust built in the daylight wavered in the darkness. Elias's nights were not peaceful. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive in the war and in his exile had a cost. He couldn't sleep for more than an hour without waking up, heart pounding, hand reaching for the revolver under his pillow. He would get up. He would check the door. He would check the shutters. He would pace the perimeter of the main room, his bare feet silent on the wood. Julianne heard him. She slept on the pallet near the hearth, separated from his bed by a hung blanket for privacy. But she heard the floorboards creak. She heard the soft click of the revolver's cylinder being checked. She heard the ragged, shallow breathing of a man expecting an attack that never came. She knew what it was. She had seen it in soldiers returning to Boston. They called it soldier's heart, or nostalgia. She knew it was a nervous system stuck in the on position. One night in late February, Elias woke up from a nightmare, the sound of the bridge snapping, and found himself standing by the window, gun drawn, aiming at the moonlit snow. He was sweating, shaking. He lowered the gun, shame burning in his chest. He turned around. Julianne was sitting up on her pallet. She was watching him. "Go back to sleep," Elias rasped. "You checked the door 3 times, she said softly. "The wind rattled it. The wind is calm tonight, Elias." He didn't answer. He couldn't explain that the threat wasn't outside. It was inside his head. The next day, Elias went out to check his trap lines. When he returned at dusk, he found Julianne working near the door. She had taken a ball of twine and several empty tin cans from the pantry, cans that had once held peaches and beans. "What are you doing?" he asked, hanging his coat. "An upgrade," she said. She had rigged a complex web of strings across the door and the shutters. It wasn't just a simple tripwire. She had created a tension system. If the door handle was turned even a fraction of an inch, or if a shutter was pried from the outside, the string would go slack, and a counterweight would drop, causing a cluster of tin cans to crash down onto a metal plate she had set on the floor. "It's a hair trigger mechanism," she explained, stepping back to admire her work. "Sensitive to 2 pounds of pressure. You don't need to check the door, Elias. If anyone touches it, the whole house will know." Elias looked at the contraption. It was ugly. It was cluttered, but he understood what it was. It was a promise. It was her saying, "I will watch the door so you can close your eyes." He looked at her. She was wiping grease from her hands, looking anxious, waiting for him to criticize it. "Does it work?" he asked. "Test it," she said. Elias walked to the door and barely touched the latch. Clang, rattle, crash. The sound was deafening. Elias jumped back, hand going to his gun out of instinct. Julianne flinched at the noise, pressing her hands to her ears, but she was smiling. "Effective," Elias said, his heart racing. "Effective," she agreed. That night, Elias lay in his bed. He looked at the string running across the room, faintly visible in the moonlight. He listened to the silence. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't get up to check the lock. He closed his eyes. The tin cans stood guard. And for the first time, Elias Thorne slept through the night. Spring arrived in March with a violence of mud. The snow melt roared down the ravines, turning the creeks into raging torrents. The road to the valley, impassable for months, began to emerge from the slush like a dark scar. The isolation was ending. The timeline was tightening. One evening, after a dinner of stewed rabbit, Elias and Julianne sat by the fire. The blueprint was on the table between them. They had spent weeks analyzing it, memorizing every line, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. But tonight, the silence was heavy with things unsaid. "Why didn't you leave?" Elias asked suddenly. He was whittling a piece of pine, the shavings curling onto the floor. "Before the snow. When you stole the plans? You could have gone to the newspapers in New York. You could have gone to the army." Julianne looked into the fire. The flames reflected in her dark eyes. "I tried," she said. "I went to a lawyer in Boston. A friend of my father's. I showed him the plans, and he patted my hand," she said, her voice bitter. "He told me I was grieving. He told me that women often don't understand the complexities of business. He said Arthur was a pillar of the community, and that I should go home and take my tonic. She looked at Elias. They don't see me, Elias. They see a dress. They see a hysterical girl. They see a uterus, not a brain. If I had gone to the army, they would have handed me back to Arthur before I finished my sentence. She leaned forward. That's why I came to you. You're the only one who matters. You're the engineer. If you speak, they have to listen. Elias stopped whittling. He looked at the knife in his hand. They didn't listen 3 years ago, he said. Tell me, Julianne said. Not about the steel. Tell me about the collapse. Elias closed his eyes. He could still smell the ozone. It wasn't loud, he said softly. That's what people get wrong. The snap, that was loud. But the fall? It was like the air was sucked out of the world. I was on the bank, checking the grade. I looked up. The train was halfway across. I saw the center truss buckle. It didn't look real. It looked like the train was floating for a second. He took a shaky breath. I saw Sergeant Miller. He was in the window of the second car. He waved at me. He thought I was waving hello. He didn't know I was screaming for them to stop. Elias opened his eyes. They were wet. I built that, he whispered. I drew the lines. I calculated the load. And I watched my friends fall into the dark because I didn't scream loud enough. Julianne moved. She didn't walk to him. She slid her chair closer. She reached out and placed her hand over his, stopping the knife from moving. You were screaming, she said firmly. You screamed in the report. You screamed in the inquiry. Arthur Sterling just made sure the world was deaf. She squeezed his hand. Her grip was strong, the grip of the woman who had held the cantilever beam. You aren't a killer, Elias. You're a load-bearing pillar that was given too much weight to hold. And you haven't broken yet. Elias looked at her. In the firelight, the scars on her face from the frostbite were fading, but they were still there. She was damaged. He was damaged. We're a pair of ruins, he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Ruins are just foundations waiting for a new design. She countered. For a moment, the air between them was charged with something that wasn't engineering. It was gravity. Two bodies, orbiting a shared center of pain, finally pulled close enough to touch. Elias turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. Her skin was rough. It felt perfect. When they come, Elias said. I won't let them take you, I know, she said. But we have to be smart. We can't shoot our way out of this. We have to build a way out. 2 weeks later, the perimeter alarm tripped. Clang, rattle, crash. It was mid-morning. Elias was in the barn. Julianne was in the house. Elias dropped his pitchfork and ran. He didn't run to the house, he ran to the ridge that overlooked the winding road leading up from the valley. He threw himself flat against the wet earth, peering through his binoculars. A carriage. A heavy, black carriage with gold trim, pulled by 4 muddy horses that were foaming at the mouth. Flanking it were 4 riders. Not outlaws. They wore badges. Deputies. And leading them, on a gray mare, was a man in a long duster coat with a silver star pinned to his chest. Sheriff Klein. Elias knew him. A fair man, but a man of the law, and inside the carriage? Elias scrambled back down the hill. He burst into the cabin. Julianne was standing by the table, the blueprint already rolled and inside the copper tube. She looked pale, but steady. They're here, Elias said. Sheriff Klein. 4 deputies. And a carriage. Julianne closed her eyes for a second, then opened them. Arthur, we can run, Elias said. There's a trail over the ridge. It's rough, but... No, Julianne said. If we run, we look guilty. If we run, the snow catches us in the high pass. We have to stand. He has the law, Jules, and we have the truth. Truth doesn't stop a bullet, no, she said, strapping the tube to her back under her shawl. But it stops a lie. Unlock the door, Elias. Let them in. Elias looked at her. This was the moment. The fortress was breached. He walked to the door. He unhooked the tin cans. He lifted the heavy oak bar. He opened the door to the spring sunlight. The carriage pulled into the yard 5 minutes later. The horses were blowing hard, steam rising from their flanks. The deputies fanned out, hands resting on their holsters. Sheriff Klein dismounted, his face grim. But Elias's eyes were fixed on the carriage door. It opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a pristine gray suit that seemed immune to the mud of the frontier. He had silver hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that were the same shade of dark brown as Julianne's, but devoid of any warmth. Arthur Sterling. He looked at the cabin. He looked at Elias standing in the doorway, hand on his Colt. He smiled. It was a smile that didn't show teeth, a smile of a predator assessing a trapped rabbit. "Mr. Thorne," Arthur said. His voice was smooth, cultured, carrying easily across the yard. "I see you've survived the winter. Remarkable resilience. Get off my land," Elias said. "I'm afraid I can't do that," Arthur said, adjusting his cuffs. "I've come a long way. And I believe you have something that belongs to me. I have nothing of yours." "Oh, but you do." Arthur's eyes shifted to the dark interior of the cabin. "You have my poor, sick niece. And you have my property." Sheriff Klein stepped forward. "Elias," he said, his tone warning, "Mr. Sterling has sworn out a warrant. He says you abducted Miss Sterling from a wagon train. He says you're holding her against her will. She came to me," Elias said. "She was dying. He says she's unwell." Klein continued, looking uncomfortable. "Mentally unwell. He has papers from a sanitarium in Boston committing her to his care." "Lies," Elias spat. "Julianne!" Arthur called out, ignoring Elias. "Julianne, my dear! Come out. It's safe now. Uncle Arthur is here." From the shadows behind Elias, Julianne stepped forward. She moved past Elias, stepping onto the porch. She stood tall, though her hands were trembling slightly beneath her shawl. "I am here, Arthur," she said. Her voice was steady. Arthur's face crumpled into a mask of theatrical relief. "Oh, thank God. Look at you, my dear. You look dreadful. Thin as a rail. What has this savage done to you?" "He saved my life," Julianne said. "Which is more than you did," Arthur sighed, turning to the sheriff. "You hear that, Sheriff? The delusion. The Stockholm Syndrome. It's exactly as the doctors predicted. She believes her captor is her savior." He turned back to Julianne, his voice dropping to a soothing, terrifying coo. "Come now, Jules. The carriage is warm. We have a doctor waiting in Denver. Just bring the items you took from the safe. Those are family documents, dear. You know you shouldn't play with grown-up business. They aren't documents," Julianne said. "They are a confession." Arthur's eyes hardened. The mask slipped for a fraction of a second. "Sheriff," Arthur snapped. "Arrest this man. Secure the girl." Klein hesitated. "Elias, step aside. Let the lady go. She stays," Elias said. He didn't draw his gun, but his stance shifted. He was a coiled spring. "Elias, don't," Julianne whispered. "I'm not letting him take you to a madhouse, Jules." Arthur stepped closer to the porch, flanked by 2 deputies. "You have a choice, Mr. Thorne. You can be the hero who found her and tragically realized she was insane, in which case there is a substantial reward. Or," he paused, lowering his voice so only Elias and Julianne could hear, "or you can be the mad engineer who kidnapped a wealthy heiress, abused her all winter, and forced the law to put him down like a rabid dog. And I will make sure the world knows you were a coward at the Purgatory Bridge and a monster in these mountains." Elias looked at Arthur. He saw the trap. It was perfectly constructed. Structural failure was imminent. If he fought, he died, and Julianne was taken. If he surrendered, he lived, maybe, but Julianne was taken. He looked at Julianne. She was looking at him, terror in her eyes. Not terror of Arthur, but terror for him. Go, she whispered. Elias, let me go. He'll kill you. I don't care, Elias said. I do, she hissed. I care. You can't fix this with a gun. Arthur checked his pocket watch. Time is wasting. Sheriff? Klein's hand went to his gun. Elias. Last warning? Elias looked at the deputies. He calculated the angles. He could take 2 of them. Maybe 3. But Klein would get him. He looked at Julianne. He saw the copper tube pressing against the fabric of her shawl. He realized then that the fortress had failed. The walls couldn't keep the world out. He had to change the design. Elias slowly raised his hands. No! Julianne cried. It's over, Jules, Elias said, his voice flat. He looked at Arthur. You want her? Take her. But you don't get the tube. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Is that so? I hid it. Elias lied. It's not on her. It's buried in the woods. Miles from here. Julianne stared at him. She opened her mouth to speak, but Elias shot her a look, a sharp, commanding look that he used when they were moving heavy timber. Trust me. I surrender, Elias said to Klein. I'll go with you. But she goes to a hotel, not a sanitarium. Or I never tell you where the papers are. Arthur studied Elias. He was a gambler, and he knew when a man was bluffing. But he also knew that Elias was an engineer. Engineers were precise. Very well, Arthur said, smiling his shark smile. We'll take you both. But if I don't have those papers by tomorrow night, Mr. Thorne, I will let the sheriff do his duty. The deputies moved in. They grabbed Elias, wrenching his arms behind his back. The cold steel of handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Another deputy grabbed Julianne. She didn't fight, but she kept her eyes locked on Elias. You're making a mistake, she whispered as they dragged her toward the carriage. I'm buying time, Elias murmured, as they shoved him toward a horse. As the carriage door slammed shut on Julianne, separating them, Elias looked back at his cabin. The door was open. The tin cans were swaying in the breeze. The fortress was empty. But the foundation, the trust between them, was the only thing left standing. The convoy moved down the mountain like a funeral procession. The sky, which had been bright only hours before, had bruised over with a violent shade of purple. The spring weather in the Rockies was a fickle beast. The warmth of the morning had melted the high snowpack, sending millions of gallons of freezing water roaring down the gullies. And now, a new storm front was colliding with that moisture. Rain began to fall. It wasn't a gentle shower. It was a deluge, cold and heavy, turning the road into a slurry of mud and ice. Inside the carriage, Julianne sat opposite Arthur Sterling. The velvet interior, once plush, smelled of damp wool and old cigars. Arthur watched her, tapping his cane against his boot. You're trembling, he observed, his voice dripping with faux concern. Withdrawal symptoms? Or just regret, calculation? Julianne said, looking out the window at the rain-lashed trees. Calculating what? How much time you have left before the asylum doctors sedate you, calculating the flow rate of the river, she said, turning her dark eyes to him. The Purgatory River is rising. The meltwater combined with this rain, the cubic footage per second will be triple the average. Arthur laughed. It was a dry, brittle sound. Always the engineer. You sound just like your father. He worried about numbers while I worried about profits. That's why he died in a rented room and I own half the territory. He died because his heart broke, Julianne said quietly. You broke it. Men break themselves, my dear. I just sweep up the pieces. Outside, Elias rode with his head down, the rain soaking through his coat. His hands were cuffed in front of him, resting on the saddle horn. A deputy rode on either side, their horses skittish in the mud. Elias wasn't looking at the deputies. He was watching the road. He was watching the way the water was cutting new channels through the dirt. He was listening to the roar of the river in the canyon below. It was getting louder. A low, grinding roar that sounded like the earth itself was tearing apart. He looked at the carriage ahead. It was heavy. Too heavy for this mud. And the wheels were narrow. Physics, he thought. Arthur Sterling understands money. He doesn't understand friction coefficients. The convoy rounded a bend, and the roar became deafening. They had reached the crossing. The bridge over the South Fork was not a grand structure. It was a wooden trestle bridge, built 5 years ago to service the mining camps. It spanned a gap of 50 feet over a gorge that was usually a trickle of water. Today, it was a raging torrent. The brown water was frothing, slamming against the canyon walls, carrying uprooted trees and boulders. The water level was dangerously high, lapping just a few feet below the bridge deck. Sheriff Klein held up his hand. The convoy stopped. Klein rode back to the carriage. Arthur rolled down the window. "Bridge looks shaky, Mr. Sterling," Klein shouted over the rain. "Water's high. Maybe we should wait it out on the ridge." Arthur leaned out, looking at the bridge. He saw only an obstacle. "Nonsense. It's a bridge. It's built to be crossed. We can't wait here, the road behind us is washing out. Drive on, but—" "I said drive on, Sheriff! Unless you want to explain to the governor why you delayed the transport of a dangerous fugitive." Klein's jaw tightened. He looked at the bridge, then at his men. "One at a time," he ordered. "Carriage goes first. Then us." Elias spurred his horse forward, ignoring the deputy who reached for his reins. "Don't do it!" Elias shouted, his voice cracking against the thunder. "Look at the pylons. The scour. The water is undermining the footings." Arthur looked at Elias with disdain. "Still the alarmist, Mr. Thorne? That bridge has stood for 5 years. It will stand for 5 minutes more. It hasn't stood against a 100-year flood." Elias yelled. "The lateral load is too high. If that carriage goes out there, the vibration alone will gag him." Arthur ordered the deputy. "I'm tired of his noise." The deputy hesitated, then grabbed Elias's bridle, pulling him back. "Quiet down, Thorne." Elias looked at the carriage window. He saw Julianne's face. She was pressed against the glass. She looked at the bridge, then at him. She nodded. She saw it too. The driver cracked his whip. The 4 horses strained. The carriage lurched forward, mud sucking at the wheels, and rolled onto the wooden deck. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of the hooves on the timber was hollow. The bridge groaned, a low, mournful sound that was almost lost in the roar of the water. The carriage reached the midpoint. Then it happened. It wasn't a snap. It was a shift. A massive driftwood log, carried by the flood, slammed into the central support pylon with the force of a battering ram. Crack. The bridge shuddered violently. The central pylon buckled. The deck listed sharply to the right. The horses screamed, slipping on the wet wood. The carriage slid sideways, slamming against the railing. The wood of the railing splintered but held, barely. The carriage was stuck, tilting precariously over the raging water, the right wheels caught in the smashed railing, the left wheels spinning in the air. "Help!" Arthur's voice shrieked from inside. "Get me out!" Sheriff Klein spurred his horse, but Elias screamed. "Stop! No more wait! If you ride out there, the whole thing goes down!" Klein froze. He looked at the tilting bridge. He realized Elias was right. "Get ropes!" Klein yelled to his deputies. "There's no time for ropes," Elias said. He looked at the deputy guarding him. "Unlock these cuffs. You're a prisoner." "I'm an engineer," Elias roared, his eyes blazing with a ferocity that made the deputy flinch. "That structure is in progressive collapse. You have 90 seconds before the torque shears the remaining bolts. Unlock me, or watch them die." Klein looked at Elias. He saw the calculation in the man's eyes. He made a choice. "Do it," Klein ordered. The deputy fumbled with the key. The metal clicked. The cuffs fell. Elias didn't wait. He didn't run to the bridge. He ran to the sheriff's saddlebag and grabbed a coil of rope and a heavy distinct tool, a lumberman's axe. He ran onto the bridge. The deck swayed sickeningly under his feet. He kept his center of gravity low, moving with the rhythmic grace of a man who knows how to walk on unstable ground. He reached the carriage. It was tilted at a 45-degree angle. The door facing up was jammed. The door facing down was hovering over the water. "Elias!" Julianne's voice. She was at the upper window, struggling to push it open. "Stay still!" Elias yelled. "Don't move your weight!" He looked at the situation. The wheel was hooked on a splintered beam. If the carriage moved, the beam would snap, and the carriage would plummet. He needed a counterweight. He needed a fulcrum. He scrambled up the listing deck to the high side of the carriage. He tied the rope to the rear axle, then threw the other end to the sheriff on the bank. "Pull taut!" Elias screamed. "But don't pull hard. Just hold the tension." The deputies on the bank hauled on the rope. The lines sang tight. The carriage stabilized slightly. Elias climbed onto the side of the carriage. He looked down through the window. Arthur was huddled on the floor, clinging to the seat, weeping. Julian was bracing herself against the frame, her face pale but focused. "Jules," Elias said, pressing his hand against the glass. "I'm going to break the window." "Cover your face." She nodded. She grabbed a cushion and shielded her head. Elias used the axe handle. Smash. The glass shattered. "Give me your hand," Elias said. "Take him first," Julianne said, pointing at Arthur. "What? He's heavier," she shouted over the rain. "If I go first, the weight distribution shifts to the low side. It'll roll. You have to take the heaviest load off the high side first." Elias stared at her. Even now, even facing death, she was doing the math. Smart girl. He grinned through the rain. He reached in and grabbed Arthur by the collar. "Move, Sterling!" Arthur scrambled up, clawing at Elias like a drowning rat. Elias hauled him out. Rough and fast. He shoved Arthur toward the bank. "Crawl! Don't walk! Distribute your weight!" Arthur scrambled away on hands and knees, sobbing. The carriage groaned. The railing gave another inch. "Now you," Elias said, reaching back in. Julianne reached up. Their hands locked. That same grip from the cellar. That same grip from the first day in the snow. Elias pulled. She came out light and fast. But as her feet touched the bridge deck, the log that had hit the pylon shifted again. The bridge gave a final, agonizing scream. The section under the carriage collapsed. "Jump!" Elias yelled. He threw himself backward, tackling Julianne. They hit the wet wood of the remaining section hard. Rolling away from the edge, behind them, the carriage, and the section of bridge it sat on, tore free. It fell into the brown torrent with a massive splash, instantly crushed by the water and debris. Elias and Julianne lay on the wet planks, gasping for air, the rain hammering down on them. They were alive. Elias looked at her. She was soaked, her hair plastered to her face, mud on her cheek. "You okay?" he asked. "I calculated the torque." She panted, a hysterical laugh bubbling up. "I was right." Elias kissed her forehead. A fierce, desperate kiss. "You were right." They made it to the bank. Sheriff Klein and the deputies were staring at the gap in the bridge, pale-faced. Arthur Sterling was sitting in the mud, shivering, clutching his chest. When he saw Elias and Julianne approach, Arthur's fear instantly transmuted back into rage. It was his defense mechanism. "You!" Arthur pointed a shaking finger at Elias. "You sabotaged it! I saw you! You panicked the horses!" He turned to the sheriff. "Shoot him! He almost killed me! He destroyed my property!" Sheriff Klein looked at the vanished bridge, then at Arthur. "Mr. Sterling, that man just saved your life. And he warned you not to cross. He's a criminal!" Arthur screamed, scrambling to his feet, trying to regain his dignity despite the mud covering his fine suit. "He's a kidnapper and a saboteur. I want him in chains. And I want that girl in the wagon." "No." A voice cut through the rain. It wasn't Elias. It was Julianne. She stepped forward. She reached down to the hem of her muddy dress. She ripped the seam. Arthur froze. From beneath the layers of her skirts, strapped to her leg with the same leather belts she had used in the snow, was the copper tube. Elias watched her. He hadn't known. He had lied to Arthur to protect her, thinking she had hidden it in the house. But she had kept it on her. She had carried the weight. "What is that?" Sheriff Klein asked. Julianne unscrewed the cap. Her hands were steady now. She pulled out the oilskin-wrapped parchment. "This," Julianne said, her voice ringing out clearly over the sound of the river, "is the reason my uncle wants me in an asylum. And it is the reason 22 men died at the Purgatory Crossing 3 years ago. Don't listen to her." Arthur lunged. "She's hysterical." Elias stepped in front of Julianne, blocking Arthur. He didn't touch him. He just stood there, a wall of stone. Arthur stopped, shrinking back. Julianne unrolled the blueprint on the saddle of the sheriff's horse, shielding it from the rain with her body. "Sheriff," she said, "you know bridges. Look at this." Klein stepped closer. He looked at the drawing. He saw the red ink. "This is the original design for the Purgatory Bridge," Julianne explained, pointing to the stamp. "Designed by Lieutenant Elias Thorne. Rejected by the contractor because of cost." She moved her finger to the margin notes. "And this is the override order. Authorizing the use of Grade C iron. Signed by Arthur Sterling." Klein looked at the signature. He looked at Arthur. "Grade C?" Klein muttered. "That's scrap iron. You don't build bridges with scrap iron. You do if you're embezzling the difference in cost," Julianne said. "My father found this before he died. He tried to hide it to protect the family name, but he couldn't destroy it. He kept it as insurance. When Arthur took over the estate, he found out it was missing." She looked at her uncle. Her eyes were dry, hard, and absolutely merciless. "He didn't come here to save me, Sheriff. He came to bury the evidence. And he was willing to put me in a madhouse to do it." Arthur was shaking his head, his face pale. "It's a forgery. She drew it herself. She's an artist, I'm an engineer," Julianne corrected him coldly. "And I know the difference between a load-bearing wall and a facade. You're a facade, Uncle Arthur. And you just collapsed?" Klein looked at Arthur Sterling. He looked at the wreckage of the carriage in the river, a testament to Arthur's judgment. He looked at the blueprint. The sheriff slowly reached for his own cuffs. "Arthur Sterling," Klein said, his voice heavy with the weight of the law, "I'm placing you under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and, well, looking at that river, attempted negligent homicide. You can't do this." Arthur sputtered as the deputies grabbed him. "I own this county. I'll have your badge, maybe," Klein said, clicking the cuffs shut. "But until then, you're riding in the back." Klein turned to Elias. He looked at the man he had almost arrested. He looked at the hands that had tied the ropes and swung the axe. "Mr. Thorne," Klein said, "I reckon I owe you an apology. And a ride back up the mountain." Elias didn't smile. He just looked at Julianne. She was rolling up the blueprint. She placed it back in the tube and screwed the cap on. She didn't hand it to the sheriff. She held it. "It's over," Elias said softly. Julianne looked at the river, then at him. "No, Elias. The demolition is over. Now we build." 3 years later. Autumn 1874. The cabin was no longer a fortress. The windows had been widened, the heavy shutters replaced with glass that let the golden autumn light flood the interior. The tin can alarm system was gone. In its place, on the porch, wind chimes made of copper tubing sang gently in the breeze. But the biggest change was the noise. The silence that Elias had once craved was gone. The yard was filled with the sounds of saws buzzing, hammers banging, and voices, young, loud, chaotic voices. There were 15 of them. Boys and girls. Some were the children of ranchers. Some were orphans from the mining camps. One was a mute boy from the Arapaho tribe who communicated through intricate carvings. They were the unwanted, the difficult, the ones who didn't fit in the pristine schoolhouses of the towns. They were gathered around a large table in the yard. On the table was a model of a truss bridge made of balsa wood. Julianne stood at the head of the table. She was visibly pregnant, her hand resting absently on her stomach. but her posture was as upright as ever. She held a pointer. "Tension and compression," she said to the group. "Who can tell me the difference? Tension is pulling," a girl with braided hair shouted. "Compression is squishing, scientific terms, Martha." Julianne smiled. "But correct. Now if we apply a load here." She placed a heavy stone on the model. The model held. "Good design." Julianne nodded. "Now, Mr. Thorne? The variable?" Elias stepped forward from the workshop. He was wiping grease from his hands. He looked younger than his years now. The haunted look in his slate-gray eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful calm. "The variable," Elias said, "is the wind." He picked up a bellows and pumped a blast of air against the side of the model. The bridge wobbled. The students gasped. "Lateral force," Elias explained. "You build for the weight of the train, yes. But you must also build for the world the train moves through. The snow. The wind. The vibration." He looked at Julianne. They shared a private smile, a communication of angles and forces that only they understood. "Nothing exists in a vacuum," Elias said. "Everything is connected. If one part is weak, the whole suffers. If one part is strong." He put his hand on the trembling model, steadying it. "It can hold the rest together." Later that evening, after the students had gone home, Elias and Julianne sat on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in hues of violet and gold. Julianne was sketching in a notebook, plans for an expansion of the workshop. Elias was watching the wind chimes. "I got a letter today," Julianne said. "From the governor. Oh, he wants to commission us. A new bridge over the gorge. A steel arch." Elias took a sip of his coffee. "Do we want it? It pays well. And he wants your name on the plaque. Designed by Elias Thorne." Elias looked at his hands. The hands that had failed once, and saved many times since. "Put Thorne and Sterling," he said. "Sterling is a dirty name in this territory, Elias. Arthur made sure of that, not Sterling the fraud," Elias said. He reached over and touched her stomach. "Sterling the engineer. You." Julianne closed her notebook. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you still hear it?" she asked softly. "The snap?" Elias listened. He heard the wind chimes. He heard the distant cry of a hawk. He heard the steady, strong beat of his wife's heart, and the life growing inside her. "No," Elias said. "I only hear the foundation settling." Epilogue. The Architect, Denver, 1910. The great hall of the new state library was silent, but it was a silence of awe, not emptiness. The ceiling soared 60 feet overhead, a marvel of steel trusses and glass that flooded the atrium with light. It was a space that felt impossible, weightless, as if the stone itself had learned to fly. A crowd of dignitaries stood in the center of the room. At the podium stood a woman in her late 30s. She had dark hair streaked with gray, and eyes the color of wet slate, her father's eyes. She wore a simple suit, but on her lapel was a brooch made of beaten copper. "My parents were not people of words," Sarah Thorne said into the microphone. Her voice was clear, resonant. "They were people of structure. They believed that the world is chaotic, and that it is our duty not to conquer it, but to build frames that allow us to survive it." She gestured to the massive archway behind her. "When I designed this library, the critics told me the span was too wide. They said the glass would shatter under the weight of the snow. They said a woman could not understand the physics of such a dome." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. "I told them what my mother told me," Sarah continued. "Gravity doesn't care about your gender. It only cares about your math." She stepped down from the podium and walked to a covered easel. "This building is dedicated to them. To Elias and Julianne, who taught me that the strongest structures are the ones that can bend without breaking." She pulled the cloth away. It wasn't a painting. It was a framed set of blueprints. The paper was yellowed with age, cracked at the folds. In the center was a drawing of a bridge slashed with a red line. But taped next to it was a second drawing, a sketch in charcoal on rough paper. It was a drawing of a cantilever brace in a root cellar. and below them both, a brass plaque read, "The blueprint of silence." They gave each other rest, so they could build the world. Sarah touched the glass. She looked up at the dome she had built, the light filtering down like grace. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty air. "The load holds." The camera pulls back, rising up through the atrium, past the steel trusses, past the glass, into the bright, open sky of the west. The wind blows, but nothing rattles. The structure is sound,